Hi, my name is Vanessa Mitchell. I'm 30 years old, and this is the story of how I stopped being the obedient daughter and finally stood up for myself by renting out my parents' house to strangers as revenge. I know, it sounds crazy. Who would do something like that? But before you judge me, you need to know everything that led up to it. Because betrayal, even when it comes wrapped in the softness of family and blood ties, is still betrayal. And mine came from the very people who were supposed to protect me, my own parents. For years, I held my tongue. I gave them the benefit of the doubt. I excused their favoritism, their constant belittling, their tendency to treat my needs like they were less important than everyone else's, especially when it came to him, my cousin Jared. I always thought that maybe, just maybe, one day they'd open their eyes and see what I really was to them, a daughter. Not a placeholder, not a backup plan, a daughter. But that day never came. What did come was something far worse. The moment they gave away my childhood room, the one safe place that ever truly felt like mine, to Jared, without even telling me. And that was the final straw. I was born and raised in Jersey City, New Jersey. My parents, Barbara and Glenn Mitchell, weren't bad people by society's standards. They were respected. Glenn was a local firefighter, now retired, and Barbara worked as a school librarian until her late 50s. We weren't rich, but we had enough, and I never lacked for food, shelter, or clothing. But emotional support, affection, recognition, that was a different story. Growing up, I was the quiet child, the good one, the invisible one. I didn't rebel, I didn't shout, I didn't slam doors. I made good grades. I got into Rutgers on a scholarship and graduated in communications. I moved out at 24 and got my own apartment in Hoboken. I paid my bills. I worked hard. I visited my parents regularly, always keeping that invisible thread between us alive, because that's what daughters do, right? But things changed when Jared came into the picture. Before I go deeper into this story, take a second and tell me in the comments, what's your name and where are you watching from? I want to know who's here listening to this, because what I'm about to share isn't just a story. It's a turning point. It's about losing everything you thought was yours and finding something even more powerful in return. If you've ever been overlooked or made to feel small in your own family, then this story is for you. And if you stay until the end, I promise you'll understand why I had to tell it, no matter how hard it was. Don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss the rest of this journey. Jared was my uncle's son, my dad's younger brother, Carl, who passed away suddenly in a car accident 5 years ago. Jared was 19 at the time. No one expected what happened next. My parents took him in, not just for a few days or a few months. No, they told him he could stay with them as long as he needed. I was supportive at first. It made sense. Jared didn't have anyone else. He was grieving, and I knew my parents, especially my mother, had a soft spot for rescuing people. But what I didn't expect was how fast the dynamic changed. Overnight, it was like I had been replaced. Jared became their golden child. They bragged about him constantly. They started comparing everything I did to his life, even though I was 7 years older, had a full-time job, paid rent, and had never asked them for anything since college. Jared, on the other hand, didn't work. He stayed home all day, played video games, occasionally took online classes but never stuck with them. Still, they made excuses for him like he was some misunderstood genius. And then came the moment that shattered everything. One weekend, I stopped by for a visit. My plan was to drop off a few boxes. I had recently downsized my apartment and asked my parents if I could store some old books and clothes in my room. They agreed, no problem. When I arrived, I headed upstairs and opened the door to what used to be mine. But it wasn't mine anymore. The posters, the bookshelf, the curtains I'd sewn with my mom in middle school, all gone. In their place was a gaming setup, a massive flat-screen TV, LED strip lights, dirty laundry scattered across the floor, and Jared himself, lounging on the bed with a controller in hand and a smug look on his face. "Hey," he said, barely acknowledging me. "Nice of you to knock." I blinked. "What? Is this?" He shrugged. "Your parents said I could have this room. They figured you didn't need it anymore." I turned and stormed downstairs. My mom was in the kitchen, stirring a pot like it was any other Sunday. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. Did you give Jared my room? She looked up, startled, but not guilty. Oh, honey, you haven't lived here in years. We just figured. You figured it was okay to erase everything that reminded you of me? I asked, my voice breaking despite my best effort. Without even asking? It's not like that, she said, wiping her hands. You've moved on, sweetie. You have your own place. Jared needs stability right now. That room was just sitting there. Just sitting there. Those words echoed in my head for days after. Just sitting there, like it was a spare chair. Not the place I had grown up in. Not the only part of that house that had ever felt like mine. I didn't speak to them for 3 weeks. And they didn't call me either. Not even once. That's when the plan began forming in my mind. I had a key. They'd never change the locks. I had a way in, and I had motive, not just for revenge, but for something deeper, a statement, a declaration, that I would no longer be the daughter who accepted less. I would no longer be invisible. If they wanted to give away the space that once belonged to me, then I would take something back, something they didn't want to give, and so I did what no good daughter would ever do. I listed their house, my childhood home, on a short-term rental platform. I picked the weeks I knew they'd be out of town visiting friends in upstate New York. I hired a cleaner. I uploaded the photos I had secretly taken on a previous visit. I used a burner number and an alias. I told myself it was just one weekend, just one moment of justice, just enough to make them feel the sting of what they had done. What happened next was far more than I ever expected. The first booking came in less than 24 hours after I posted the listing. I had no idea the demand for family homes in Jersey City could be so high on short notice. But apparently, people were eager for cozy spaces during summer. I used an alias, Renee Adams, and set up a completely separate bank account. The thrill I felt watching the booking confirm was unlike anything I'd experienced before. I wasn't proud of it, not really. But I also wasn't sorry. And that, in itself, said a lot about how far I'd been pushed. I remember the first guests clearly. A couple from Connecticut with 2 small kids, looking for a weekend getaway near Liberty State Park. They arrived with smiles and beach towels and rolling suitcases. I gave them instructions on how to retrieve the key from the lockbox I'd installed and asked them to treat the home with respect. I didn't have to be there. That was the beauty of it. All of it was remote, perfectly orchestrated, neat, quiet. Unlike the chaos that had built up inside me for years. The money showed up in the new account 3 days later. It wasn't much, but it wasn't about the money. It was about power, about finally having control in a dynamic where I'd always been dismissed. I kept the bookings going, spacing them out every few weekends. I never left anything that would identify me. No notes, no traces. Everything was sanitized, professional, cleaners in and out, guests respectful, no damage. If my parents had security cameras, I would have been caught immediately, but their outdated sense of technology was the only thing in my favor. They still thought Facebook was cutting edge. By the second month, I'd made enough to cover most of my own rent. And the most twisted part? They still had no idea. My parents would leave town and come back to a house that smelled faintly of air freshener, with floors cleaner than when they'd left. But things didn't stay smooth forever. Of course they didn't. Life has a way of balancing the scale when you start playing with fire. It all started unraveling the day Jared found a receipt. It wasn't even from a guest. It was from the cleaning service. I'd forgotten it under the sink, tucked behind the trash bags, after one of the Friday turnovers. He called me 2 days later, confused. "Hey," he said, his voice lazy as ever. "Do you know anything about some cleaning lady named Carla who's been coming to the house?" I froze. "What are you talking about? There was this receipt under the sink. Thanks for using Crystal Clean Services. Hope to serve you again, Miss Adams." "You know anything about that?" My mouth was dry. "I have no idea. Maybe Mom hired someone." He laughed. "You know your mom would rather scrub the walls with a toothbrush than pay someone. Anyway, I thought it was weird." I deflected, changed the subject, ended the call, but I couldn't sleep that night. I kept imagining Jared poking around, putting things together, checking dates, realizing there were patterns. I even thought about stopping everything, deleting the listing, pretending it never happened. But I didn't. Instead, I booked another guest. The escalation was subtle at first. My parents started mentioning odd things. Doors slightly ajar when they were sure they had closed them. A faint smell of perfume that didn't belong to any of them. Towels folded in ways they didn't recognize. Nothing major. Just enough to plant seeds of confusion. Then came Labor Day weekend. They'd planned to go to Cape May. I knew because my mother had posted a smiling selfie with my dad on the ferry. I'd scheduled a new guest, a solo traveler named Brianna, who was visiting Jersey City for a photography project. She was sweet and tidy, left a thank you message in the guest book I had hidden in the back of my old closet, but she left behind a lens cap. That tiny, circular plastic disc was the bomb that blew everything up. When my parents came back, Jared apparently found it near the windowsill. He recognized it immediately. He was an amateur photographer himself, one of his brief hobbies before he abandoned it like everything else. He asked my parents if they'd had company while they were away. They were confused. Said no. Jared showed them the cap. My dad found the guest book, hidden beneath a pile of old board games. That night, my phone rang. It was my mother. "We need to talk. Now." I considered ignoring it, pretending I was busy, but I knew this moment was inevitable. So I drove to their house, my stomach churning the whole way. They were waiting in the living room when I arrived, both standing, arms crossed, the guest book open on the coffee table like evidence in a trial. "Vanessa," my father said, his voice calm but cold. "What is this?" I didn't lie. I didn't stammer. For the first time in my life, I stood straight, looked them both in the eye, and said, "That's what happens when you treat your daughter like she doesn't exist." My mother's face flushed. "You rented our home to strangers?" "No," I replied. "I rented my home, or at least what used to be my home before you gave it away to someone who does nothing but sponge off you." My father's jaw tightened. "That's not your decision to make." "Neither was giving my room away," I snapped. "But you did it. Without telling me. Without thinking twice." There was silence for a long time. Jared wasn't even there. Probably out with friends, enjoying the perks of his new life in my space. "We were trying to help him," my mother said, softer now. "He had no one. And I have no one either, apparently," I said. "You never offered me that kind of support. You never asked me how I was doing. You only talk about Jared. You act like I'm a ghost." I didn't cry. I thought I would. But the anger had dried up the tears. All that was left was truth. My father sat down slowly. My mother turned her face away. No one spoke for almost a full minute. "You broke our trust," she finally said. "No," I corrected. "You broke mine, years ago. I'm just now acknowledging it." I left that night without apologizing. 2 days later, I received a letter. Not an email, not a phone call. A formal letter, printed and signed, informing me that I was no longer welcome in the house. My key would no longer work. They were changing the locks. If I wanted to talk, I could do it through a lawyer. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny, but because it was the most attention they had given me in years. They wanted war? They had it. Because I wasn't finished. Not even close. The letter stayed on my kitchen counter for days, untouched, like a challenge waiting to be answered. Each time I passed by it, I felt that familiar burn in my chest. Betrayal masquerading as formality. A printed signature from my own father. A warning that I was now a stranger to the people who had raised me. There was something humiliating about it. And yet, strangely liberating too. For the first time, there was no more pretending. No more hollow Sunday dinners. No more forced calls. We were done playing family. But I wasn't done. Not yet. I thought I would be angry. I thought I'd throw something, scream, maybe even cry. But what came instead was a strange kind of stillness. A quiet clarity that spread through me like cold water. I realized that what they had taken from me wasn't just a room. It was identity, history, roots, and they'd given it to someone who saw it as a free upgrade, a gaming den, a crash pad. Jared hadn't earned that space. He hadn't bled for it. I had. It was that clarity that led me to do something I never imagined myself doing. I hired a lawyer, not to sue them, not yet, but to understand what my options were. Because while they had written me off like some rebellious teenager, I was still their daughter. I still had rights. And my name? It was still listed on the deed of the house. That was the first revelation. Years ago, when I was in college, my parents had added my name to the property in a joint ownership transfer for tax purposes. They never removed it, never bothered, never thought I'd care. But that small, forgotten signature had power. Power they didn't expect me to use. Technically, my lawyer said, looking over the paperwork, you have equal ownership. They can't legally kick you out without a formal buyout or a court ruling, which they won't get, especially not with your history. So, what does that mean? I asked, barely breathing. He smiled. It means you have leverage. The word sat in my mouth like honey. Leverage. I didn't tell them right away. I waited. I watched. Through a mutual friend in the neighborhood, I heard that Jared had invited more people to live there. Friends, a girlfriend, maybe even her dog. My parents were out of town again, and the house had become a social pit stop. They still thought of Jared as lost, vulnerable, someone who just needs time. But he was throwing parties in their absence, using their money, burning their trust as easily as I once burned inside my childhood bedroom. So I paid a visit. Not unannounced, not like a teenager sneaking in. I called ahead, left a message. Then I showed up mid-afternoon with a printed copy of the deed and my lawyer's letter of intent. Jared opened the door with a slice of pizza in hand and a confused look on his face. "What are you doing here?" he asked, stepping aside like he still owned the place. "I live here," I said, pushing past him into the hallway. "Or at least I own half of it." He laughed, but it was shaky. "Very funny." I handed him the envelope. "Give this to my parents. Or read it. I don't care." He called me a psycho. I ignored him. I walked into what used to be my room, now cluttered with half-empty soda cans, Xbox controllers, and dirty socks, and stood silently for a moment. I didn't touch anything. I didn't have to. I had presence now. And proof. Later that week, the calls started. First my mother, then my father. I didn't answer. Then came emails, texts, even a handwritten letter, this time without a lawyer's signature. They wanted to talk. "We didn't know," they said. "We didn't mean to push you away," they pleaded. "Let's be a family again." I didn't reply. I let the silence speak. Instead, I moved forward with what I knew had to be done. If I couldn't feel at home in their house, then I'd make it into a business. A formal, lawful business. I had the right, and now I had a purpose. My lawyer helped me file a petition to dissolve the co-ownership unless they were willing to buy me out. The moment that paperwork arrived, the dynamic shifted. My parents weren't angry anymore. They were scared. They offered to have a conversation. They offered to remove Jared if I withdrew the petition. They begged me not to ruin the reputation of our family in court. But the truth is, it was never about ruining them. It was about rebuilding me. I didn't want revenge for the sake of pain. I wanted justice, recognition. I wanted to be seen, heard, treated like more than a shadow lingering at the edges of their precious new life with Jared. So I made them an offer. I would withdraw the legal petition if they sold the house and gave me my equal share. A clean break. They could go live wherever they wanted. With Jared, without Jared, it didn't matter. But that house? It no longer belonged to them. Not the way it used to. It had been broken, and no one could unbreak it. They resisted. Of course they did. For weeks, they tried to sway me. They offered money, but less than the full value. They played the guilt card, the memory card, the "we raised you" card. But I stood firm, and eventually, they gave in. The house went up for sale that fall. It sold in 3 weeks to a young couple from Newark. I never met them. I didn't need to. I received my portion of the sale, a clean wire transfer to my account, enough to put a down payment on my own place. Not an apartment, not a rented space, a home. The day I closed on my new townhouse, still in Jersey City but far from the ghosts of my old street, I stood alone in the living room, barefoot, the light spilling through the tall windows. I could still smell fresh paint. The floors gleamed. The walls waited for memories. Mine. I sat down on the floor and exhaled. Not a dramatic sigh, just breath, real breath, because for the first time in years, I wasn't holding it anymore. I had reclaimed my voice. And I was just getting started. The townhouse felt too quiet at first. After years of clashing voices, of always being on edge, of holding my breath around people who never truly saw me. The silence was jarring. I'd grown used to shrinking in the presence of others, used to second-guessing my feelings, used to questioning whether I deserved the space I occupied. Now, with a set of keys that belonged only to me and rooms that echoed with no judgment, I had to learn how to exist on my own terms. I wasn't used to that kind of freedom. It felt unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. I didn't decorate right away. I let the space breathe. I walked barefoot from room to room, touching the smooth walls, standing in corners just to feel what it was like to take up space without asking permission. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around being enough for someone else. I didn't owe explanations anymore. I didn't need to perform. I didn't need approval to make choices for myself. I started with small things. A potted plant in the kitchen, a bookshelf that I built with my own hands, even though I accidentally hammered my thumb and cursed out loud like a sailor. A mug I bought with the words, "I choose me," printed in cursive. Every object had intention. Nothing was inherited, borrowed, or gifted with emotional strings. It was mine, earned, chosen, not handed down as a consolation prize. Around the same time, I started therapy. It wasn't something I was proud of at first, not because I was ashamed, but because admitting I needed help felt like admitting weakness. But my therapist, Dr. Renner, was nothing like I expected. She didn't ask about my childhood in the first session. She didn't dive into trauma. She asked simply, "What do you want to feel, Vanessa?" I didn't know how to answer. Not what I wanted to fix or what I wanted to achieve, but what I wanted to feel. It caught me off guard. After a moment of silence, I said, "Safe, seen, chosen." She nodded slowly. "Then let's begin from there." And we did. Week by week, hour by hour, I peeled back layers of myself I hadn't looked at in years. I talked about the time in high school when my parents missed my final debate championship because Jared got suspended and needed family support. I talked about how they never visited me during college except when it was convenient, how every achievement I brought home was met with polite nods, while Jared's smallest efforts were praised like miracles. I hadn't realized how deep the roots of resentment went until I started pulling them out. It wasn't just about the room. It never had been. That was just the final insult in a long, quiet war I had waged in silence for decades. The room was symbolic. It was the place where I read books under the covers, where I cried myself to sleep after disappointments, where I dreamed out loud into the darkness and believed for a while that I mattered. Giving it away wasn't just a logistical decision. It was an erasure. As I spoke more in therapy, something strange happened. I started dreaming again, literally. I would wake up remembering vivid details, a childhood memory reimagined, a confrontation with my mother that never happened but should have, a version of myself that was louder, braver, unfiltered. One night, I dreamt I was back in that room, but it wasn't Jared's version. It was mine. Posters on the walls, the floral bedding, the window cracked open with the breeze drifting in, and I was sitting on the bed, watching a younger version of myself, maybe 10 years old, writing in her journal, lips moving with silent thoughts. When she looked up, her eyes met mine. "You waited too long," she said. I woke up with tears on my face. That morning, I made a decision. It wasn't enough to start over. I needed to do something with what I had been through. I needed to turn the pain into something that meant more than just a story of survival. I needed to create. So I started a blog. It was anonymous at first. Just The Girl Without a Room. I wrote weekly entries, raw and unedited. Stories about invisibility within families, about quiet daughters and golden boys, about gaslighting masked as love. I didn't hold back. I didn't name names. But I told the truth, my truth. To my surprise, people responded, not just with sympathy, but with resonance. Women from all over the country commented, emailed, shared their own versions of being erased, replaced, silenced. The blog grew faster than I expected. Within a few months, I was invited to speak on a small podcast about toxic family dynamics, then another, then a local women's event in Newark. The first time I stood in front of a crowd and said, "I rented out my parents' house without their permission as a way to reclaim power," people laughed. Not at me. With me. It wasn't shameful. It was real. It was bold. It was something people secretly wished they had the courage to do. But more importantly, I followed it with everything that had come after. The therapy, the healing, the painful growth. I became something I never expected. A voice. I still didn't speak to my parents. Not directly. But I heard through mutual contacts that they'd sold their second car, that they'd moved to a smaller place, that Jared had eventually left too, apparently got into trouble with some online business scam and skipped town. I didn't celebrate their misfortune, but I didn't grieve it either. I had long since stopped trying to control outcomes that weren't mine. My home by then was alive with energy. I'd painted one of the bedrooms a bold teal and turned it into a writing room. I bought a used piano off Craigslist and taught myself to play again, something I hadn't done since I was a teenager. I hosted dinners with friends, let laughter echo through the walls, filled the silence with music and stories. One evening, as I was cleaning up after a group of women from my book club had gone home, I stood at the window with a glass of wine in hand and caught my reflection. I looked older, softer around the edges, but stronger, more grounded. My hair was tied back. There was a smudge of lipstick on the rim of the glass. My shirt had a sauce stain from the pasta. And yet, I had never looked more like myself, not the version they raised, the version I rebuilt. And then, just as I was settling into this new rhythm of life, a letter arrived in the mail. Handwritten, no return address, just my name. The handwriting was familiar. Inside was a card. No long explanation, no apology, just one sentence. We thought we were doing what was best, and now we know we weren't. No signature, but I didn't need one. I folded the card, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it in the back of my bookshelf. Not because I forgave them, but because I no longer needed to keep them in the center of my story. They were a chapter. I had many more to write. Winter came to Jersey City with a sharpness that cut through everything. Wind slapping against windows, trees shedding their last leaves, breath turning visible in the air. My townhouse, despite its insulation and heat, carried a quiet chill that winter. Not from the cold, but from something lingering. I had spent the better part of the year rebuilding my identity, anchoring my life around healing, around freedom, around new beginnings. But there was one thing I hadn't faced yet, not fully. I hadn't seen them, not in person, not since the night I walked out of that house, the letter clenched in my hand, the weight of years behind my silence. And the letter they sent, the one without a signature, unsettled something in me. Not because it hurt, but because it wasn't enough. It was too late, too small, too easy. A sentence scrawled on a card doesn't undo a lifetime of being dismissed. And yet, it lingered. Their words, or lack of them, haunted the corners of my otherwise calm nights. I started dreaming again. This time, not of my childhood bedroom or my younger self, but of confrontation. Dreams where I was screaming, where my mother was crying, where my father looked away in shame. Sometimes Jared appeared too, arms crossed, smirking like nothing ever touched him. These dreams always ended with me waking in a sweat, heart pounding, words stuck in my throat. So I decided I needed closure. Not the tidy Hollywood kind where everyone cries and hugs and the past is forgiven, but real closure, where truths are spoken aloud, where silence is broken, where I walk away knowing I left nothing unsaid. I reached out first. I sent an email, short, direct. I said I would be attending a community event in Jersey City the following Saturday, one I knew they usually volunteered at during the holidays. I didn't ask to meet. I didn't beg for their time. I simply told them I'd be there, and that if they wanted to talk, they knew where to find me. They didn't respond. Saturday arrived with heavy clouds and the threat of snow. The event was held at the old church near the square, a holiday drive that brought in donations for shelters across the county. I came early and helped stack boxes of canned goods, organized coats by size, greeted volunteers with the kind of practiced cheer that felt both authentic and detached. I wasn't there to work. I was there to wait. 2 hours passed before I saw them. My father came first, alone, wearing the same gray jacket he always wore when he didn't want to be noticed. His eyes scanned the room until they landed on me. And then he just stood there, like he wasn't sure if he should approach. Or maybe he was waiting for me to move. I didn't. So he came forward. We stood under a flickering fluorescent light by the side door, where the noise of the event faded slightly. "I got your message," he said. I nodded. I figured. He looked older than I remembered. Tired. Thinner. There were lines around his mouth I hadn't noticed before. His hands fidgeted with his sleeves the way they always did when he was uncomfortable. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Try the truth," I replied. He looked down. "We thought we were doing what was right. For Jared. For us. We didn't mean to hurt you. But you did." He flinched. Just slightly. "But I saw it." "I know," he said. "We were blind." I waited. I didn't interrupt. Let the silence stretch. Let the weight of it sit where it belonged. He exhaled. "We didn't see you. Not the way we should have. I think part of us assumed you didn't need us anymore. You were always strong, quiet, independent." "That's not strength," I said. "That was survival." He looked at me, eyes glassy. "I'm sorry." I didn't say anything. I let him feel the sting of that silence, too. A few moments later, my mother appeared. She looked more guarded than he did. Her expression was tight, her arms crossed over her chest. When she saw me, her mouth trembled, but she didn't speak right away. "I didn't know you were going to be here," she said. "I warned you," I replied. "You just didn't answer." She nodded slowly. "I didn't know if I could face you. And yet, here you are." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel moved by them. Not in the way I used to. I felt detached. Present, but no longer tangled in the emotional web that had defined our relationship for so long. "We messed up," she said quietly. "Badly. You made a choice," I corrected. "Multiple choices. Every time you chose him over me, that was a decision. He was grieving," she said. "So was I. When did you ever ask me how I felt?" Silence again. "I wanted you to be proud of me," I said, my voice rising slightly, raw. "I did everything right. I worked hard. I gave you space. I never asked for more than you were willing to give. And still, it was never enough." She reached for me then, but I stepped back. "I don't need a hug," I said. "I need acknowledgement." She pulled her hand back. "Then here it is. You were always enough. More than enough. We just didn't know how to say it." "That's the tragedy," I said. "Not that you didn't feel it, but that you didn't say it until it was too late." There was a long pause. People passed by us with boxes and bags, laughing and chatting, oblivious to the storm brewing in our quiet little corner. "What do you want from us now?" my father asked. "Nothing," I said honestly. "I don't need anything. I just needed to say this, out loud, to your faces." They both looked at me, unsure of what to say. The weight of years settled between us like dust. "I've moved on," I said, "and I'm not angry anymore. But I won't forget. I won't rewrite the story just to make it more comfortable for you." My mother's tears fell then, silent, steady. "I still love you," she whispered. "I believe you," I said. "But love isn't always enough, and sometimes it comes too late." I didn't wait for more. I turned and walked away, my boots clicking on the tiled floor, the cold air from the door brushing against my cheeks. I didn't cry. I didn't look back. I didn't need their reaction to validate the moment, because it wasn't about them anymore. It was about me, and for the first time in my life, I felt like I had said exactly what needed to be said. No filters, no fear, just truth. After that confrontation at the community event, I didn't expect to hear from them again. I hadn't asked for more conversation. I hadn't left any door open. But still, the silence that followed was different. It didn't feel like abandonment anymore. It felt like peace. Like something had been settled. Not perfectly, but honestly. And that was more than I'd ever expected to get. Life, from that moment on, began to take a new shape. I no longer carried the weight of invisible expectations. I no longer rehearsed conversations in my head, desperate to say things I never had the courage to voice. I had spoken. They had listened. Maybe not enough. Maybe too late. But it had happened. Closure didn't come in a single moment. It came in pieces. Small decisions. Quiet mornings. The ability to laugh without guilt. To rest without tension. To plan a future without wondering if I was disappointing someone. And with that clarity, everything else in my life began to unfold in ways I hadn't even anticipated. My blog grew faster than I could keep up with. What began as a place to vent anonymously became a platform, a space where other people, especially women, shared their own stories of being pushed aside, erased, forgotten. I started receiving emails every week from readers who said they finally felt understood, that they finally realized they weren't alone. That gave me a sense of purpose I had never known before. For years, I had twisted myself into someone palatable, someone non-threatening, someone silent. Now I was writing with fire, with truth, with power. Eventually, I was approached by a small publishing house that had found my blog through one of those podcast interviews I gave. They asked if I would be interested in turning my story into a book. Not just the revenge part, but the entire journey, the silencing, the erasure, the rebuilding, the emotional reckoning that so many people endure in silence. At first, I hesitated. Writing for strangers online felt safe. Writing a book meant vulnerability on a much larger scale. But after sitting with the offer for weeks, I realized I had already survived the hardest part. The story had already been lived. Now, telling it was just a continuation of the healing. I said yes. Writing the book was harder than I expected. I had to revisit moments I thought I had buried for good. I had to relive conversations that had once shattered me. But I also got to put those pieces back together with intention. This time, I got to control the narrative. I didn't soften the edges. I didn't skip the pain. But I also didn't let the pain be the only thing. In the process, I discovered parts of myself I hadn't known were still there. My sense of humor, my resilience, the tenderness I still carried even after everything. I wasn't just angry. I wasn't just wounded. I was full, complex, human. When the manuscript was done, I cried, not because of what I had written, but because of who I had become while writing it. I was no longer Vanessa Mitchell, the invisible daughter. I was Vanessa Mitchell, the author. The book launched 6 months later, under the title, The Room They Gave Away. A friend of mine from the blog circle designed the cover, a spare, haunting image of an open door with light spilling into darkness. It felt poetic, symbolic, honest. I didn't expect much from the launch. A few online sales, maybe a book club or two. But the reception surprised me. People connected to the story deeply, not because they had lived the exact same thing, but because they recognized the feeling. The ache of not being chosen, the grief of realizing your family loved an idea of you, not the real you, the relief of finally stepping into your own light. Emails poured in, DMs from readers. Some even found me at readings and whispered, "Thank you," like I had spoken aloud something they were still too afraid to name. The most unexpected message came from Jared. It arrived one evening as I sat in my living room, flipping through old photos I had pulled from a shoebox I'd been avoiding. The subject line was simple: "I read your book." The email itself was short, 3 lines. I read it all. I didn't know it was that bad. I'm sorry I made it worse. I left New Jersey, trying to figure myself out. Hope you find what you needed. I didn't reply. Not because I was angry, but because I had nothing left to say. Sometimes closure isn't about a final conversation. Sometimes it's about walking away with the knowledge that you've already said everything that needed to be said. My parents never contacted me again after that day at the event. I didn't chase them. I didn't try to bridge the distance. I honored the space between us as sacred, necessary. We weren't enemies. We just weren't family in the way I had once hoped. And that was okay. In the spring, I started leading writing workshops at the community center. At first, it was just a few women in folding chairs, writing about loss and love and fear. But over time, it became something more, a sanctuary, a place where people could say the hard things. I wasn't a therapist. I wasn't trying to fix anyone, but I had lived something that left me cracked open, and from that place, I could hold space for others to do the same. One night, after a session, a young woman lingered behind while the others packed up. She looked at me and said, "Do you think people ever really stop wanting their parents' approval?" I looked at her for a long moment. Then I said, "I think we stop needing it when we start approving of ourselves." She nodded. Her eyes welled up. Then she left. That moment stayed with me. I realized then that what I had been searching for all along wasn't revenge. It wasn't even justice. It was validation. And the moment I gave it to myself, everything else stopped mattering as much. Years from now, if someone asks me what this chapter of my life was really about, I'll tell them it was never about a room. Not really. It was about reclaiming something sacred. Not just space, but voice, worth, identity. And once I had those things back, the rest became background noise. I live quietly now. Not because I'm hiding, but because peace is louder than chaos ever was. My home is filled with books, music, and moments I choose. I still get letters from readers. I still drink coffee from that mug that says I choose me. I still walk barefoot across the floors at night just to remind myself that I belong here. And every once in a while, when I pass by the mirror, I smile. Not because I'm perfect, but because I recognize the woman staring back. She's not waiting to be chosen anymore. She already did that for herself. 2 years later, the past feels like a house I used to live in. I still remember the layout, the colors on the walls, the way the air smelled at dusk. But it's no longer mine. I don't revisit it often. I don't dwell. But sometimes, it visits me. I'll be walking home from the market, carrying fresh flowers and oranges, when I pass by a family gathered on their porch. A mother laughing with her daughter, a father wrapping holiday lights around a banister, a cousin chasing a dog through the yard. And in those moments, there's a flicker, a quiet ache that rises without warning. Not regret, just recognition, that I never really had that, and I probably never will. But I've made peace with that truth. It doesn't hurt the way it used to. It doesn't define me anymore. If anything, it reminds me how far I've come. I still live in the townhouse. Same teal walls, same piano by the window. Over time, it's become more than a house. It's a memory palace of everything I rebuilt. The bookshelf now holds copies of my book in multiple languages. A framed email hangs above my desk, one from a woman in Poland who said my story gave her the courage to leave a toxic home and start over. I don't know her name. She didn't sign it. But her words stayed with me. Sometimes people assume that healing is a finish line, that there's a moment you cross over into a field of endless calm, where nothing from the past touches you. But that's not real. Healing is cyclical. Some days you feel strong, radiant, unshakable. And then, out of nowhere, a voice from the past shows up in your head, whispering old doubts. You stumble. You breathe. You remind yourself who you are now, and you keep going. That's the truth no one tells you about growth. It's not linear. It spirals, it dips, it doubles back. But every loop brings you further from the version of yourself who once believed she didn't matter. Last fall, I was invited to speak at a conference for women writers. It was held in a restored hotel in Boston, all high ceilings and stained glass windows. I was nervous. Imposter syndrome still follows me sometimes like a stubborn shadow. But I took the stage, hands shaking slightly, and looked out at the sea of expectant faces. And then I told them about the room, the one that was mine until it wasn't, the one that taught me the difference between being loved and being chosen. I spoke for 40 minutes. I didn't read from notes. I told the story the way it lived in me, not as an outline, but as a pulse. And when I finished, the room stood up, not in applause, but in solidarity. Women wiping tears, women nodding, women who had also lost things they could never quite explain. Afterwards, a woman my mother's age came up to me. She didn't say much, just took my hand, squeezed it, and whispered, "I wish I had heard this when I was your age." That night, alone in the hotel room, I cried. Not because I was sad, but because something inside me had finally been witnessed, fully, without apology. I still haven't spoken to my parents. Last I heard, they had moved again, somewhere quieter, smaller. I've received 2 cards since then, one for Christmas, another for my birthday. Both signed simply, Mom and Dad. No long messages, just a few polite lines. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Some people are meant to stay in your story. Others are meant to teach you how to write your own. Jared never reached out again. His email remains unread in a folder I no longer check. I sometimes wonder where he ended up, whether he changed, whether he ever found the stability my parents had been so desperate to give him. But I've stopped making that my concern. His path isn't mine to trace anymore. What matters now is what I've created, what I continue to create. The writing workshops have grown into a full-time program. We now offer free weekly sessions, open mic nights, and even a mentorship group for young girls learning how to find their voice in noisy homes. I watch them share poems and stories and journal entries, hands trembling but eyes alive. And every time, I see a version of myself in their words. The quiet girl, the forgotten daughter, the one who waited too long to speak, until she didn't. Every year, on the anniversary of the day I left my parents' house for good, I do something small to honor the version of me who survived that silence. Sometimes it's a solo dinner at my favorite restaurant. Sometimes it's a walk along the waterfront, breathing in the city lights like medicine. One year, I wrote a letter to my younger self and read it aloud in the mirror. It started with, "You were never wrong for wanting more." I still keep a box under my bed. Inside it are pieces of the past I haven't thrown away. The guest book from my room, the letter from my father's lawyer, the first check from the publisher, and a photograph of my room before it was cleared out. The curtains, the bookshelf, the softness. It's not a shrine. It's a reminder, a compass pointing to the fire I came from. People often ask me now, during interviews or events, what advice I'd give someone who feels invisible in their own home. I always say the same thing. Start by hearing yourself, even if no one else does yet, even if your voice trembles, even if your hands shake. Because the moment you hear yourself clearly, everything changes. I'm not angry anymore. That's the truth. Anger carried me through the doorway, but grace helped me stay. Grace for myself, for the girl who waited, for the woman who walked, for the version of me that still, on occasion, misses a place that never truly held her. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like peace, like no longer needing the apology, like living a life so full, so honest, so wildly yours that the wounds simply stop bleeding. This is my life now. Not perfect, not painless, but real, and entirely mine. And if you, reading this, have ever felt the sting of being replaced, erased, or silenced, I want you to know, you are not invisible. You are not too much. You are not wrong for wanting space, or love, or truth. And when the time comes to reclaim your room, whatever that room is for you, do it boldly, even if your voice shakes, even if your legs tremble, because that moment, that choice, will be the beginning of everything, and you deserve everything. Have you ever felt like your voice didn't matter in your own family? Like the space that once belonged to you was handed over without a second thought? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear from those who've had to reclaim their worth the hard way. If this story touched something inside you, please like and subscribe to hear more raw, honest journeys like mine. Send this to someone who needs the courage to speak up and take their power back. Remember, healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means choosing yourself again and again. Thank you for listening to my story.